In the small hours of 30th of October 1955, at Sunken Orchard, the Woodward estate above Oyster Bay Cove on Long Island, the house was finally quiet again. The last echoes of a dinner in honor of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor have faded. Their names still hang in the corridors like perfume. On her bedside table, Anne Woodward lays out her evening gloves with automatic care, smoothing each pearl-buttoned wrist as if preparing for another photograph. Just 15 years earlier, New York radio publicity had christened her the most beautiful girl in radio, captured in studio lights and caption lines. Now the light is harsher. A hallway lamp left off, a loaded shotgun by the door. There have been reports of a prowler, a string of burglaries, nervous whispers at neighboring estates. Both Anne and William Billy Woodward Jr., heir to the Hanover National Bank fortune, have gone to bed with guns at hand. When the sound comes, a thud, a movement, Anne steps into the dark, gloveless hands tightening on the stock. By the time life will call it the shooting of the century, the gloves will be evidence of nothing at all. On 12th of December 1915, in Pittsburgh, Kansas, a small mining and railroad town in the southeastern corner of the state, Angeline Lucille Crowell was born into circumstances that are respectable but far from privileged. Her father, M. Jesse Crowell, works as a streetcar conductor and holds the title of former military officer, lending the family a certain dignity despite modest means. Her mother, Ethel Smiley Crowell, brings intellectual ambition to the household. She is a schoolteacher with a master's degree from the University of Kansas, an unusually advanced credential for a woman in the 1920s and a sign of determination to rise through education and respectability. The family's stability, however, proves fragile. By the mid-1920s, Jesse and Ethel's marriage dissolves, and both eventually remarry, creating a fractured domestic landscape for young Angeline. The disruption seems to catalyze something in her, a decision that she will not simply accept the hand she has been dealt, but will actively reshape her circumstances and identity. By her late teens, she has shed the name Angeline Lucille Crowell and rechristened herself Anne Eden, a choice that suggests both ambition and calculation. The new name is smoother, more cosmopolitan, easier to imagine on a society page or a theater program. It is, in its small way, an act of self-editing that prefigures a lifetime of careful image management. In 1937, having made her way to New York City through means not fully documented in surviving records, Anne signed with the John Robert Powers Agency, one of the most prestigious modeling agencies of the era. The work requires rigorous physical discipline. Posture must be corrected and maintained through hours of standing and walking. Hands must be trained to display fabric and jewelry without tremor or awkwardness. Facial expressions must be practiced until they appear both natural and perfectly controlled. Contemporary photographs from Powers Agency files and magazine spreads show young women who have mastered this vocabulary of gesture and expression, their bodies transformed into instruments for selling glamour and aspiration. By 1940, Anne had expanded her career beyond print modeling into radio acting and performance. Publicity photographs from CBS show her in evening gowns, her dark hair styled in the fashion of the moment, her hands encased in long gloves that serve both practical and symbolic functions. The gloves are costume pieces, certainly, but they also help an ex-Midwestern girl, daughter of a streetcar conductor, product of a broken home, appear as if she has always belonged under the chandeliers of New York's broadcasting studios and nightclubs. In promotional materials, she is described as the most beautiful girl in radio, a title that combines physical attractiveness with the democratic promise of mass media. Beauty that can be heard by anyone with a radio set, glamour accessible to millions. The narrator observes that, even before Anne Eden meets the world of old New York money and established social hierarchies, she's already practicing the essential skill that will define her adult life: containment. She contains her Midwestern accent, smoothing its rougher edges and adopting the more neutral tones considered appropriate for broadcasting and high society conversation. She contains her gestures, learning which movements appear refined and which betray her origins. She contains her history, offering only carefully selected details about her background to interviewers and acquaintances. The gloves she wears on air and in publicity shots become emblems of this larger project of self creation and self concealment, beautiful surfaces that hide everything beneath. On a smoky evening in late 1939 at Fifi's Monte Carlo, a fashionable nightclub in Manhattan's theater district, the orchestra plays while waiters navigate between tables crowded with well dressed patrons. The club's clientele represents a particular slice of New York society, not the oldest families or the most rigidly proper, but rather the intersection of wealth, celebrity, and a certain sophisticated worldliness. Among the regulars are men whose family names once appeared on Ward McAllister's famed 400 list of New York's social elite in the Gilded Age, alongside newer fortunes made in banking, manufacturing, and entertainment. The architecture of privilege has shifted since the 1890s from Fifth Avenue drawing rooms to nightclub banquets, but the essential dynamics of money, status, and access remain. Anne, now working as a showgirl in the club's elaborate production numbers, adjusts her long gloves just inside the wings, waiting for her cue to enter. The costume she wears, feathers, sequins, carefully calculated to reveal and conceal, is designed to attract attention while maintaining the fiction of theatrical respectability that separates showgirls from other women who work in the night economy. She has learned to move through the club with a particular kind of poise, acknowledging the gazes directed at her while maintaining enough distance to signal that she is a performer rather than available company. It is here, in this space between performance and prostitution, theater, and society, that Anne meets William Woodward Sr., chairman of Central Hanover Bank and custodian of a substantial old money fortune built on banking and thoroughbred horse racing. Contemporary accounts from multiple biographers describe how Woodward Sr. becomes fascinated with Anne, showering her with jewelry, perfume, and cash, the traditional gifts through which wealthy men signal their intentions and establish informal contracts with beautiful young women. The arrangement they develop is discreet but understood. Anne becomes his mistress, occupying a category distinct from both wife and casual encounter, receiving financial support in exchange for her time, attention, and discretion. At some point during this relationship, the exact timeline remains unclear in surviving documentation. William Woodward Sr. makes an extraordinary proposal. According to Roseanne Montillo's reconstruction in Deliberate Cruelty, drawing on interviews and archival research, the senior Woodward suggests that Anne might redirect her romantic attention toward his son, William Billy Woodward Jr. The suggestion, if accurately reported, represents a remarkable blurring of boundaries. The father essentially offers to facilitate his mistress's marriage to his heir, transforming her from kept woman to potential daughter-in-law, from hidden relationship to dynastic alliance. The narrator reflects that in this exchange, seduction itself becomes a form of social engineering, a calculated intervention in the reproduction of elite families and the transfer of wealth across generations. Anne's gloves and gowns, her carefully cultivated beauty and charm, are repurposed as instruments not merely of personal advancement, but of dynastic strategy. Whether the proposal originates primarily with William Sr., or whether Anne herself suggests the arrangement remains ambiguous in the sources, an ambiguity that will later feed speculation about her motives and character. What is documented is the outcome. Anne shifts her attention to Billy Woodward Jr., and a courtship begins that will culminate in one of the most discussed marriages of the 1940s. The woman who is hired, in effect, to entertain the elite is about to be invited, or to maneuver herself into marrying into it, transforming her relationship to money and status from temporary and contingent to ostensibly permanent and secured. The transition will require her to master an entirely new set of performances and to convince a skeptical audience that she deserves a role she was never originally cast to play. On a summer day in 1943 in New York City, Anna Eden marries William Woodward Jr. in a ceremony that society columns record with a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed skepticism. The union fuses Anne's hard-won beauty and cultivated glamour to a fortune rooted in the Central Hanover Bank, later Hanover National Bank, and the historic Bel Air Estate and Stud Farm in Maryland, one of the oldest and most successful thoroughbred operations in American racing history. The match raises eyebrows precisely because it crosses boundaries that old money families prefer to keep intact. Billy Woodward is Groton and Harvard, heir to banking wealth and sporting traditions, his name appearing in Time magazine's Milestones section as a figure of social and financial significance. Anne is a radio beauty and former showgirl whose background in Kansas and whose years working in nightclubs make her an unlikely candidate for acceptance by families who pride themselves on multi-generational continuity and careful marriage strategy. Photographs from the wedding and the early years of their marriage show Anne transformed. No longer the showgirl in revealing costumes, but Mrs. William Woodward, Jr., in impeccably tailored day suits, gloves buttoned with precision as she stands beside Billy at racetracks, charity benefits, and society events. The visual evidence suggests successful assimilation. She looks the part, carries herself with appropriate dignity, demonstrates mastery of the external markers of her new status. Yet, beneath this polished surface, tensions are already visible to those who look closely. Billy's mother, Elizabeth Elsie Crider Woodward, represents the old guard's attitude toward such marriages. Polite in public, privately convinced that her son has married beneath his station, committed to ensuring that if Anne must be accepted into the family, she will at least be properly trained to perform her role correctly. The newlyweds establish a pattern of residences that reflects their dual position in both New York society and the racing world. A Manhattan address for the social season and business obligations, and access to Sunken Orchard on Long Island's North Shore, a former Gold Coast estate featuring French-style formal gardens and a playhouse originally designed for another elite family's leisure. The house sits on land that was once part of the concentrated wealth of Long Island's Gold Coast, the string of estates built by Vanderbilts, Morgans, and their peers during the Gilded Age. The architecture Anne now inhabits belongs to a world that once embraced Astors and Whitneys. Her challenge is to make it seem natural that she walks these terraces and hosts guests in these rooms, to erase the distance between the Kansas streetcar conductor's daughter and the woman receiving society at a Long Island estate. The marriage gives Anne access to stages she once could only dream of entering, the paddocks at major racetracks, the social circuits of Palm Beach and Newport, the dinner tables where business and politics are discussed alongside racing bloodlines and art collecting. But the performance required of her is now continuous and high stakes. As a showgirl, she could step off stage and become herself again. As Mrs. Woodward, there is no backstage, no moment when the performance can be set aside. Every word, gesture, and choice of clothing is observed and interpreted. Every social interaction carries potential judgment about whether she truly belongs or is merely playing a role she has learned. The narrator observes that the marriage operates as social architecture, a structure designed to contain and display Anne's beauty and charm within acceptable frameworks, to transform her from spectacular outsider into respectable insider, to ensure that her children will be legitimate Woodwards regardless of lingering questions about their mother's origins. The structure is beautiful from outside. The estate, the jewels, the magazine photographs of the glamorous couple at racing victories. But like all architecture, it both enables and constrains, providing shelter while also setting firm boundaries around what is possible and permitted. Behind the closed doors of the various Woodward residences, not everyone in the extended family is applauding the casting. Elsie Woodward's reservations are shared by others in their social circle who remember Anne's past and question whether a showgirl can ever truly become one of them, whether acquired polish can ever equal inherited position. The skepticism creates pressure that will shape the marriage's dynamics in ways neither Anne nor Billy may fully anticipate at the wedding. By 1946, in the immediate post-war years, Anne Woodward is no longer a showgirl or radio personality, but firmly established as Mrs. William Woodward, Jr., mother of 2 young sons who would inherit the Woodward name and fortune. The domestic setting is often the Woodward Mansion at 9 East 86th Street on Manhattan's Upper East Side, a substantial townhouse that serves as both residence and stage for the family's social obligations. The house, associated with Billy's parents William Sr. and Elizabeth Elsie Crider Woodward, carries the weight of family history and expectation. Anne is not simply living in a beautiful home, but occupying a space that has hosted generations of Woodward family gatherings, and that embodies standards of taste and behavior she must learn to replicate. Biographers and social chroniclers describe Elsie Woodward as a formidable representative of old New York's elite, a woman who embodies the codes and prejudices of her class with unwavering conviction. Stories circulated about her, some perhaps apocryphal, others well documented, paint a picture of someone who would endure significant inconvenience rather than breach the invisible lines separating her world from those beneath it. One frequently repeated anecdote claims she would refuse to speak directly to a chauffeur, communicating instead through intermediaries to maintain proper social distance. Whether literally true or not, such stories convey the intensity of her commitment to hierarchy and the challenge she represents for a daughter-in-law who has crossed class boundaries to enter the family. For Anne, the relationship with Elsie becomes a prolonged education in everything that money alone cannot purchase and that her previous training has not provided. The curriculum is unwritten but comprehensive, transmitted through observation, correction, and the subtle signals of approval or disapproval that govern behavior in elite circles. She must learn which fork to use for which course, not as a matter of arbitrary etiquette, but as a marker of having grown up in households where such distinctions are absorbed from childhood. She must understand which charities are appropriate for Woodward patronage and which, though worthy, are too associated with other families or social climates to be suitable. She must master the art of conversation at mixed dinners, which topics can be discussed and which must be avoided, how to be interesting without being assertive, how to demonstrate intelligence without appearing to compete with the men present. While no formal lesson plan survives documenting Anne's transformation from showgirl to society matron, contemporary etiquette manuals and the documented routines of similar families suggest what this education must have entailed. Thank you notes must be written by hand on appropriate stationery within the correct time frame after receiving hospitality or gifts. Seating charts for dinners requires understanding of precedents and social dynamics. Who should be placed beside whom to facilitate conversation or business connections, who must be kept separated due to rivalries or past conflicts. French phrases must be deployed correctly in conversation, signaling familiarity with European culture and the international circuits of elite leisure. Each of these skills, taken individually, might seem trivial. Accumulated, they constitute a comprehensive system for identifying who truly belongs to a particular social world and who is merely visiting or pretending. The gloves Anne adjusts before leaving the house for luncheons and committee meetings are no longer the theatrical costume pieces of her showgirl days. They have become armor in a more serious sense, protection against the scrutiny of women like Elsie Woodward and her peers, who watch for any slip that might confirm their suspicion that Anne remains fundamentally an outsider, playing a part. The texture of the gloves, fine kid leather, precisely fitted, becomes part of her defensive equipment, a way of signaling through material objects that she understands quality and propriety, even if her background did not naturally instill such knowledge. The narrator reflects that the finishing school Anne never attended as a young woman reappears in her adult life, disguised as family expectation and social obligation. The education is more demanding precisely because it is informal and never-ending, because there is no graduation ceremony marking successful completion, only the ongoing test of each social interaction and the constant awareness that acceptance is provisional and could be withdrawn if she fails to maintain her performance at the required level. Yet, even as Anne works to master these codes and demonstrate her worthiness for inclusion, some observers insist on remembering where she started, on keeping alive the knowledge of her origins as a way of maintaining their own superior position and reminding her that her place in their world is a concession rather than a birthright. On racing days in 1954, at venues like Gulfstream Park in Florida or Bel Air, Stud in Maryland, news photographs and newsreel footage capture Billy and Ann Woodward standing near the paddock rails, as their champion colt Nashua becomes one of the most celebrated thoroughbreds of the decade. The images that circulate in newspapers and sports magazines show a particular vision of their marriage. Billy in tweeds or racing silks, Anne in carefully chosen dresses and coats with her ever-present gloves, both smiling at photographers or watching the horses with apparent shared pleasure. The coverage treats them as a power couple of the racing world. He provides the bloodlines and expertise cultivated through family tradition. She provides glamour and social polish that makes their success photogenic and newsworthy. Nashua's victories generate substantial publicity and cement the Woodward's position in thoroughbred racing's elite circles. When the colt wins major races, telegrams of congratulation arrive from trainers, fellow owners, and racing officials. Champagne flows in private boxes. Anne's gloved hand rests lightly on Billy's arm for photographers documenting their triumphs. The public narrative presents their partnership as harmonious and mutually reinforcing, Billy's expertise and Anne's beauty combining to create a winning team both on and off the track. This carefully constructed public image serves important functions for both of them. For Billy, Anne's presence at racing events demonstrates that the Woodward line has produced not just a serious horseman, but a sophisticated couple capable of representing their family's interests in an increasingly international and media-conscious sporting world. For Anne, the racing photographs document her transformation from nightclub performer to legitimate member of the elite circles she married into. She is no longer Anne Eden the showgirl, but Mrs. Woodward the owner's wife, her past increasingly obscured by her present position. Yet beneath this glossy surface, multiple biographical accounts suggest the marriage is already troubled. Susan Broady's book, This Crazy Thing, called Love, and other sources describe a relationship marked by increasing volatility, arguments fueled by alcohol, jealousies, and suspicions about potential affairs on both sides. Fundamental incompatibilities of temperament that parties and racing victories cannot resolve. Contemporary gossip columns, constrained by libel law and the conventions of the era, hint at tensions through careful language about marital difficulties and strains, allowing readers to infer what cannot be stated directly. The architecture of their public performance requires both Anne and Billy to maintain appearances regardless of private conflicts. At racetracks and society events, they must present a united front, must smile for photographers and make polite conversation with fellow owners and racing officials, must behave as if their marriage represents the successful merger of beauty and wealth, old money and new glamour. The gloves Anne wears for these occasions are not merely fashion accessories, but part of the costume required for this ongoing theatrical production, markers of refinement and control that help conceal whatever emotions she might actually be experiencing. The narrator observes that on the grandstands and in the winner's circle, the Woodward marriage appears as a partnership in victory, a collaboration that produces both sporting success and social standing. In private, however, the relationship increasingly resembles a contest over legitimacy and belonging, Billy perhaps questioning whether Anne will ever truly understand or appreciate the world he was born into, Anne perhaps resenting his ability to take for granted the position she has worked so desperately to achieve and maintain. When divorce is whispered, and multiple sources suggest that Billy periodically contemplated ending the marriage during this period, what is at stake extends far beyond the personal relationship. For Anne, divorce would mean losing not just a husband, but her hard-won position, being cast out of the social world she has spent years penetrating, potentially being reduced once again to the status of beautiful woman without particular position or security. For Billy, divorce would mean admitting a failed marriage and perhaps facing his mother's implicit "I told you so" about the unwisdom of marrying a showgirl in the first place. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, according to various accounts published after the tragedy, Billy Woodward periodically discussed divorce with friends and family, suggesting that his marriage to Anne had not brought him the companionship or satisfaction he had hoped for. One particularly specific claim, published in the New York Press, states that in 1947, Billy formally requested divorce, which Anne refused, a detail that, if accurate, reveals the extent of her determination to maintain her position regardless of the marriage's emotional reality. In the elite circles of old New York money, a showgirl who marries up and then divorces down becomes a cautionary tale, a woman who has grasped at status only to lose it through inability to maintain the marriage that granted her access. The consequences of such failure extend beyond social embarrassment to economic vulnerability. Without Billy's name and fortune, Anne would retain her beauty and her acquired skills in upper-class presentation, but would lose the institutional position and financial security that marriage provides. She would likely be forced to reinvent herself once again, to find another wealthy man willing to overlook her increasingly complicated history, or to accept a permanent diminishment of her social position. Anne's daily routines during this period increasingly include not just the traditional obligations of thank you notes and committee meetings, but a constant vigilance about her social standing. She must monitor who takes her telephone calls and who claims to be unavailable when she rings, who continues to include her on guest lists for important events, and who quietly drops her from invitation lists, who still welcomes her presence in the inner circles at fashionable nightclubs like the Stork Club and El Morocco, and who has begun to treat her as someone who no longer quite belongs. The gossip columns and memoirs of people who observed her during these years remember her as simultaneously dazzling and brittle, impeccably dressed and groomed, witty and charming in conversation, but also tense with the effort of maintaining her position, eager to prove that she belongs in rooms that were not originally designed to include women like her. The ritual of adjusting her gloves before stepping from the car into a restaurant or club entrance becomes increasingly weighted with significance. The gesture is ostensibly about ensuring perfect appearance, about maintaining the standards of grooming and presentation that her position requires. But it also functions as a kind of armor checking, a verification that her defenses are in place before she enters spaces where she must perform flawlessly or risk revealing the anxiety and desperation beneath her polished surface. In an era when a woman's economic survival and social identity depend heavily on her marital status and her husband's position, the performance of poise becomes a form of insurance against catastrophic loss. The narrator reflects that for Anne Woodward, deportment has evolved beyond its original function as charm and attraction into something more desperate, a system for preventing the catastrophic fall back into the obscurity and vulnerability she escaped through beauty, determination, and calculated performance. Every perfectly executed social interaction, every flawless outfit, every gracious note sent at the appropriate time represents an investment in maintaining her tenuous position. The education she received from Elsie Woodward and absorbed through observation of how old money families operate has become not a sign of her successful integration, but rather evidence of how much work is required to maintain the illusion of belonging. This same fear of falling, of losing her position, of being revealed as someone who never really belonged, of being cast back into the world without the protection of Billy's name and fortune, will later make the threat represented by a rumored prowler feel more terrifying than it perhaps objectively should. When physical danger and social vulnerability combine, when the material threat to her home and family merges with the ongoing psychological threat to her status and security, Anne's responses will be shaped by years of living under enormous pressure to maintain performances that grow increasingly exhausting and difficult to sustain. In 1955, along the wooded lanes and estate driveways of Oyster Bay on Long Island's North Shore, conversation among property owners turned repeatedly to security concerns and reported break-ins. The North Shore of Long Island, often called the Gold Coast for the concentration of great fortunes that built estates there during the Gilded Age, remains home to wealthy families despite the social and economic changes that have reduced some grand houses to institutional uses or subdivision. For those who remain, the era's prosperity and security seem increasingly fragile, threatened by crime that does not respect the walls and gates meant to preserve elite privacy. Reports circulating through the community describe a string of burglaries targeting homes in the Woodward's neighborhood. Later police records will identify Paul Worths, a young man from the area, as responsible for several attempted break-ins during the autumn of 1955, creating legitimate cause for concern among estate owners who have grown accustomed to feeling protected by their wealth and isolation. The reports generate anxiety that spreads through dinner party conversations and telephone calls between neighbors, creating an atmosphere of heightened vigilance and fear. The Woodwards respond to these threats as their class and personal experience have trained them by preparing to defend their private space. Both Anne and Billy are experienced hunters. Billy, through the traditional sporting education of wealthy men who travel internationally for game, and through more recent acquisition of skills meant to demonstrate her fitness for the life she has married into. They retire to separate bedrooms at Sunken Orchard, each equipped with a loaded shotgun placed within easy reach, transforming the domestic architecture of their home into something closer to a fortified position. The arrangement combines elements of country house formality, separate bedrooms being traditional among some elite couples, with Cold War-era anxiety about threats both foreign and domestic, personal and ideological. This pattern of wealthy families responding to perceived threats through private security measures has deep roots in American history. Since the Lindbergh kidnapping in 1932, when the infant son of aviator Charles Lindbergh and Anne Morrow Lindbergh was taken from their New Jersey home and later found dead, America's wealthy families have lived with heightened awareness of their visibility and vulnerability. Security firms specializing in protecting elite clients have proliferated. Estate designs increasingly incorporate features meant to deter intruders. Guard patrols and elaborate alarm systems become as standard in wealthy neighborhoods as landscaping and architectural detail. For women like Anne Woodward, security consciousness adds another dimension to the already complex work of managing an elite household. She must coordinate with staff about protocols for answering doors and telephones, must ensure that groundskeepers and gardeners remain alert for suspicious activity, must balance hospitality toward legitimate visitors with caution about strangers who might represent threats. The domestic sphere that etiquette manuals present as her natural domain becomes a space requiring constant vigilance and management of potential danger. The narrator observes that for families like the Woodwards and their neighbors, safety is never simply a feeling of security arising from comfortable circumstances. It is instead an infrastructure requiring continuous maintenance and investment. Locked doors and gates, security staff, protocols for responding to suspicious sounds or sightings, and ultimately weapons kept ready for use if other defenses fail. The estate architecture that appears from outside as gracious and welcoming is designed internally to provide multiple layers of protection, to ensure that those inside can feel safe, despite knowing that their wealth and prominence make them potential targets. On the night when this carefully constructed security system fails at Sunken Orchard, when the sound comes from inside rather than outside the house, when the threat proves to be not a stranger but a family member misidentified in darkness, it will be Anne's finger on the trigger rather than an intruder's hand on a weapon. The same readiness to defend her home and family that the security culture encourages will produce a tragedy that no amount of careful planning or defensive preparation could have prevented or anticipated. On the evening of 29 October 1955 at a Locust Valley estate on Long Island, financier Florence Tucker Baker hosted an elaborate dinner in honor of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. The guest list represents a particular slice of international society: wealthy Americans who collect titles and celebrities, European aristocrats who have learned to cultivate rich Americans, and socialites who understand that proximity to royalty, even abdicated royalty, confers a certain glamour that money alone cannot purchase. Billy and Anne Woodward are among those invited, their presence signaling their acceptance, at least in this circle, as legitimate members of the elite despite the ongoing skepticism from old guard families who remember Anne's showgirl past. Contemporary accounts of the dinner describe the predictable elements of such occasions: polished silver reflecting candlelight, courses prepared by skilled kitchen staff, conversation flowing around the table touching on topics considered appropriate for mixed company, racing results, travel plans, mutual acquaintances, nothing too serious or controversial that might disturb the carefully maintained atmosphere of leisure and refinement. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor living in quasi-exile following Edward VIII's 1936 abdication to marry the twice-divorced American Wallis Simpson, bring their own complicated history to the table. He is still remembered as a former king who chose love over duty, she as the woman for whom he sacrificed a throne, both now occupying an ambiguous social position that makes them simultaneously fascinating and slightly scandalous. For Anne Woodward, the evening represents a kind of culmination. She, who once adjusted her gloves in nightclub wings, now performs the same gesture at a dinner table where a former king makes polite conversation. She has traveled an extraordinary distance from Kansas and nightclub stages to this moment, has transformed herself through determined effort and performance from showgirl to accepted guest at dinners hosted for royalty. For a few hours, surrounded by other people whose positions are also somewhat complicated or achieved rather than inherited, she can perhaps feel that she has successfully completed the journey she began decades earlier. Yet beneath the evening's polished surface lies considerable tension. The marriage that brings Anne to this table is, by multiple accounts, deeply troubled. She and Billy have reportedly argued earlier in the day. Alcohol, which flows freely at such events, may intensify whatever underlying conflicts they carry with them to dinner. The social performance they must maintain, appearing as a harmonious couple, playing their assigned roles in the evening's choreography, requires suppressing or concealing whatever private emotions or conflicts they are experiencing. The candlelight and fine china, the Duchess's famous jewels, and the Duke's royal bearing create an atmosphere that seems removed from ordinary concerns and conflicts, but no amount of elegance can actually resolve the fundamental problems that have made their marriage increasingly difficult to sustain. When the dinner concludes and guests depart for their various homes and hotels, Anne and Billy drive back to Sunken Orchard, leaving behind the protective environment of public social performance and returning to the private space where their conflicts cannot be so easily managed or concealed. The shotguns waiting in their separate bedrooms, ostensibly protection against prowlers, but also symbols of the violence and danger that have become woven into their domestic life, represent a very different kind of reality from the one performed at the dinner table. The narrator reflects that the evening at Locust Valley represents everything Anne Woodward fought to achieve and enter: the glittering social world of the very wealthy, the proximity to international celebrity and historical figures, the assumption that she belongs at such occasions rather than serving them or watching from outside. The dinner table is the stage she once dreamed of reaching, the audience she once worked to impress and convince, yet leaving that table and returning to Sunken Orchard, she moves from the protective performance of public social life back into a private sphere where fear, conflict, and danger wait. Before dawn breaks on 30th of October, the same society that watched her perform at the dinner will be debating whether she has committed murder, and the gloves she wore so carefully all evening will have been set aside in favor of a weapon whose discharge will destroy the life she spent so many years constructing and defending. In the early hours of 30th of October 1955, at Sunken Orchard, Anne Woodward wakes to a sound, in her later account, something moving on the roof or in the hallway, an ambiguous noise that in her semi-conscious state registers as potential threat rather than household routine. The exact sequence of events that follows will be reconstructed multiple times through police investigation, grand jury testimony, and decades of subsequent analysis. But the essential facts are not disputed. Anne takes up the shotgun she has placed beside her bed, steps into the darkened hallway, sees a figure approaching from the direction of Billy's bedroom, and fires the weapon at a distance later measured by investigators at approximately 25 feet. The ammunition used is birdshot, relatively light pellets designed for hunting fowl, rather than the heavier shot used for larger game. Under normal circumstances, as one later medical examiner comments, such ammunition normally wouldn't have killed him at that range. The pellets would cause painful but not necessarily fatal injuries, would create multiple superficial wounds rather than deep penetration. But in this instance, through what might be called terrible accident or tragic mischance, one pellet ricochets at an unusual angle, or fragments, in a way that sends a piece of shot into a vulnerable point. It enters Billy Woodward's temple, penetrating the skull and causing massive brain trauma that makes his death essentially immediate. Police arriving at Sunken Orchard in response to the emergency call find Anne holding her husband's body, sobbing and apparently in shock. The scene they encounter, the damaged door where the shot struck, the paper wads from the shotgun cartridge scattered on the floor, the weapon itself, the body, will be photographed and measured and analyzed as evidence. According to reconstructions based on police reports, Anne tells Lieutenant Half, one of the responding officers, "I fired the shot," and explains that she believed the figure in the hallway was the prowler who had been reported in the neighborhood, the intruder she and Billy had been preparing to defend against. The gloves Anne had laid aside hours earlier when, preparing for bed, the gloves she wore to the Duchess of Windsor's dinner, the gloves that represented all her years of effort to appear refined and controlled, are now irrelevant, useless accessories from a life that ended the moment she pulled the trigger. In a matter of seconds, the marriage that structured her entire adult identity, the position she fought so hard to achieve and maintain, the carefully constructed performance that allowed a Kansas showgirl to become Mrs. William Woodward, Jr., all are reduced to evidence in a potential homicide investigation, crime scene photographs, police reports, testimony that will be parsed for signs of deliberate violence disguised as accident. The narrator observes that the rituals and skills that once protected Anne, the good posture learned through modeling work, the appropriate words acquired through observation of elite families, the steady hands trained to display jewelry without tremor, offer no script for this moment, no protocol that can help her navigate the catastrophe she has caused or endured depending on which interpretation one accepts. All her education in deportment and etiquette, all her mastery of social performance, all her determination to maintain her position despite constant scrutiny and skepticism, become instantly irrelevant when faced with her husband's body and the weapon in her hands. The next stage of Anne Woodward's story will not unfold in courtrooms through the traditional mechanisms of criminal justice, but rather in newspaper columns and drawing room conversations, through grand jury proceedings that conclude quickly and through social judgments that will pursue her for the rest of her life. The legal system will clear her, finding the shooting accidental, but the verdict that matters most to Anne, the judgment of the society she worked so hard to enter and whose acceptance she so desperately craves, will never be fully rendered, will remain permanently ambiguous and conditional, neither complete forgiveness nor absolute condemnation, but rather a kind of perpetual exile disguised as tolerance. Within days of the shooting, newspapers across the country report the death of William Woodward, Jr., heir to the Hanover banking fortune and prominent figure in thoroughbred racing circles, killed by his wife under circumstances that hover ambiguously between accident and something more intentional. Life magazine, always eager to sensationalize stories that combine wealth, beauty, and violence, will soon publish a feature under the headline "The Shooting of the Century," transforming the Woodwards' private tragedy into national entertainment, reducing the complexity of their lives and relationship to a lurid narrative designed to sell magazines and satisfy middle-class readers' fascination with elite scandal. In Nassau County, Long Island, a grand jury is convened to hear evidence and testimony about the shooting. Anne appears before them, providing her account of the night's events. The prowler reports that had created legitimate fear, the decision to keep loaded shotguns accessible, her confusion when woken by a noise in the dark, her terrible mistake in firing at what she believed was an intruder, but what proved to be her husband. After approximately 30 minutes of deliberation, a remarkably brief period given the stakes involved, the grand jury declines to indict her, concluding that the shooting was accidental rather than intentional, that no criminal charges should be filed. The decision is bolstered by subsequent developments. Police arrest Paul Worths, a local young man who admits to attempting to break into houses in the neighborhood, including the Woodwards' estate, on the night of the shooting. Worths pleads guilty to burglary charges, providing uncomfortable corroboration of Anne's story about a prowler, suggesting that her fear was based on real threat rather than paranoid invention or convenient excuse. The legal case against Anne essentially collapses in the face of this evidence. however suspicious the circumstances might appear. However convenient Billy's death might be for a wife trapped in an unhappy marriage, the grand jury finds insufficient grounds to proceed with criminal prosecution. Publicly, Elsie Woodward, the mother-in-law who never fully accepted Anne, who represented the old guard skepticism about showgirl heiress marriages, issues a carefully phrased statement. I know Anne loved Billy very much, and the shooting could be nothing but an accident. The words, parsed closely, offer support while maintaining certain carefully calibrated distances. Elsie knows rather than believes, speaks of Anne's love for Billy in past tense, frames the shooting as nothing but accident in language that might equally suggest absolute conviction or public performance of family solidarity, regardless of private doubts. Yet, while Elsie's public statement provides cover for Anne's legal situation, the private attitudes of the society they both inhabit are more complicated and less forgiving. According to later accounts by people who observed New York's elite circles during this period, the Woodward case became a source of macabre entertainment and endless speculation at dinner parties and society gatherings. One particularly telling anecdote, repeated in multiple sources, has the Duchess of Windsor, at whose dinner party the Woodwards appeared hours before the shooting, joking that nothing like a murder in the country brightens the social season, treating the tragedy as a musing scandal rather than human catastrophe. The comment, if accurately reported, reveals the cruelty that can lurk beneath society's polished surface, the way that others' tragedies become material for gossip and dark humor among people whose privilege insulates them from most serious consequences. The narrator reflects that the legal system may clear Anne Woodward of criminal responsibility, but the verdict that truly matters is delivered in drawing rooms and social clubs, in the decisions about which invitations she receives and which parties exclude her, in the subtle signals through which elite society communicates who belongs and who has been cast out. This social verdict will prove far more consequential than the grand jury's decision, will shape the remainder of her life more powerfully than any legal judgment could, will exile her from the world she fought so hard to enter more effectively than any prison sentence ever could have accomplished. By 1957, just 2 years after the shooting, Sunken Orchard had been sold, the estate where Billy Woodward died passing out of the family's control and into other ownership. The house's western wing will eventually be altered by subsequent owners, its grounds repurposed, its connection to the Woodward tragedy gradually fading as new residents impose their own histories and preferences on the property. For Anne, the loss of Sunken Orchard represents both practical consequence and symbolic exile. She can no longer retreat to the Long Island estate that represented her achievement of social arrival, can no longer host guests on the terraces where she once demonstrated her successful transformation from showgirl to society wife. Anne and her 2 young sons move into the Woodward Mansion at 9 East 86th Street in Manhattan, the house long associated with Billy's parents and particularly with Elsie Woodward's formidable presence. The arrangement places Anne under her mother-in-law's direct supervision and control, a situation that must be profoundly uncomfortable for both women, given their complicated history and the circumstances that have made this living arrangement necessary. Contemporary accounts and later biographical research suggest that Elsie's public support before the grand jury, her statement that the shooting was nothing but an accident, came with implicit or explicit conditions: no criminal trial that would generate embarrassing testimony and publicity, but also no continued prominent presence in New York society, no pretense that Anne can simply resume the position she held before Billy's death. Within months of these domestic arrangements being established, Anne is urged, or perhaps ordered, to take her mourning abroad, to remove herself from New York, where her presence creates discomfort and reminds people of scandal they would prefer to forget. Reports from this period and later biographical accounts suggest that substantial sums from the Woodward fortune are deployed to facilitate her departure and to discourage further scandal or publicity that might damage the family's reputation. One article speculates that money changes hands to ensure certain stories are not published, certain investigations are not pursued, certain social doors remain at least partially open despite widespread private skepticism about the official accident narrative. In Venice and other European cities favored by wealthy American expatriates, regular patrons at establishments like Harry's Bar, the famous Venice restaurant and bar that attracted international celebrities and exiled socialites, begin noticing an American widow who drinks heavily and dresses with impeccable care, still wearing the gloves and jewels that signal her continued connection to wealth, even as her behavior suggests psychological distress and social isolation. She remains in these European spaces for extended periods, neither fully settled nor exactly traveling, occupying a liminal zone where American expatriates and European society mix without either fully accepting or rejecting her presence. Anne retains financial connection to the Woodward fortune through trusts established for her sons and presumably through some settlement or arrangement that provides for her maintenance as Billy Woodward's widow. Her material circumstances remain comfortable, perhaps even luxurious by ordinary standards. She can afford good hotels, fine restaurants, expensive clothing and jewelry, but her social identity, the position she worked so desperately to achieve and maintain, has been effectively severed. She exists in a state that contemporaries might have called half-mourning, but that more accurately resembles permanent exile, too notorious to be welcomed back into the old New York society she once longed to inhabit, too dependent on connections to the Woodward fortune to fully break away and establish an entirely independent existence, too marked by scandal to be treated as simply another American widow living abroad. The narrator observes that power in the world Anne Woodward inhabited includes not just the obvious mechanisms of wealth and social position, but also the subtler capacity to cast someone out without explicit decree, to make clear through accumulated small exclusions and withdrawn invitations that someone is no longer considered to belong. Anne is never formally banished. Elsie Woodward does not hold a council and pronounce sentences. Society does not vote on her expulsion. Yet the effect is unmistakable. She has been removed from the center she once occupied, has been placed at the margins where she can be observed, but not fully participated with, where she remains visible enough to serve as cautionary tale, but excluded enough to demonstrate the costs of crossing boundaries or failing to maintain the performances her position required. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Anne Woodward moved between Europe and New York in patterns that suggest neither full exile nor comfortable return, but rather a kind of restless displacement, occupying spaces where wealthy Americans and international society intersect without either community fully embracing or rejecting her presence. She frequents the Palace Hotel in St. Moritz, Switzerland, and similar establishments where exiled American socialites, European aristocrats of diminished fortune, and international celebrities maintain the rituals of elite leisure despite being somewhat separated from the centers of power and social prominence they once inhabited or aspired to occupy. It is during this period, at St. Moritz in 1968, that Anne briefly encounters Truman Capote, the writer whose celebrity in the 1960s rivals that of any literary figure of his generation. Capote, having achieved enormous commercial and critical success with In Cold Blood, and having established himself as chronicler and participant in high society through his famous black and white ball in 1966, is fascinated by stories that combine glamour and darkness, elegance and violence. He becomes increasingly obsessed with Anne Woodward's history, seeing in her story material that perfectly illustrates his themes about American society, class boundaries, and the performances required of those who cross them. By the mid-1970s, Capote had been working for years on his long-promised novel Answered Prayers, which he has described as a devastating portrait of the society that embraced him, a work that will reveal the secrets and scandals concealed behind the polished surfaces of elite life. In November 1975, Esquire magazine prepared to publish excerpts from the unfinished novel, including a chapter titled La Côte Basque, 1965, that presents thinly veiled portraits of real society figures, their names changed, but their identities transparent to anyone familiar with the social world Capote depicts. Among the characters in La Côte Basque 1965 is Anne Hopkins, a portrayal of Anne Woodward so thinly disguised that readers will have no difficulty identifying the real person being depicted. In Capote's narrative, constructed from gossip speculation and his own imagination, as much as from established fact, Anne Hopkins is presented as a cold-blooded murderer who deliberately killed her husband, a showgirl who never belonged in the world she married into, and who destroyed the man who gave her access to it. The characterization is devastating, stripping away any ambiguity about the shooting's accidental nature, and presenting Anne as a calculating predator rather than a tragic figure caught in circumstances beyond her control. The old lessons Anne learned in her transformation from showgirl to society wife, how to hold a glass correctly, when to speak and when to remain silent, how to move through rooms with grace and apparent confidence, offer no defense against a novelist's portrayal. Capote's pen accomplishes what the grand jury declined to do and what society's whispered judgments never quite completed. It fixes Anne definitively as murderess, transforms her ambiguous story into clear narrative of guilt and deception, and presents this narrative to an audience of millions through the pages of a major national magazine. The narrator reflects that, once again, Anne Woodward finds herself subject to others' power to define her identity and control her story. Just as her mother-in-law Elsie Woodward and the social circles she aspired to join once held power to include or exclude her, to validate or question her belonging, Truman Capote now wields a different but equally consequential power, the ability to write her into literary history as a cautionary figure, to transform her life into a story that serves his artistic purposes regardless of how she might wish to be remembered or understood. The grace and refinement she cultivated so carefully, the performances she mastered so thoroughly, are treated in Capote's version as masks concealing murderous intent, as evidence not of achievement but of deception. Before readers can purchase the Esquire issue containing La Cote Basque 1965, before Capote's characterization of Anne Hopkins can circulate widely and become the dominant narrative about Anne Woodward's life and actions, Anne will make a final decision about who controls her story and how it ends. On 10th of October 1975, in her apartment on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, an address that still signals her connection to wealth and social position despite the years of exile and diminished circumstances, Anne Woodward dies by suicide after ingesting cyanide, according to multiple contemporary newspaper reports and subsequent biographical accounts. The method she chooses is notably dramatic and certain, leaving no possibility of rescue or reversal, suggesting determination to end her life definitively rather than making an ambiguous gesture that might or might not result in death. A suicide note is reportedly found with her body, though its full contents are never made public. One phrase that does circulate, quoted in various sources, including Vogue magazine years later, asks the unnamed reader to remember Anne Woodward, a plea for memory, or perhaps for a particular kind of remembrance, a request that she not be forgotten, or that she be remembered accurately, rather than through others' narratives and characterizations. The timing of Anne's suicide, occurring just weeks before Esquire magazine publishes Truman Capote's La Cote Basque 1965, generates immediate speculation about cause and effect. Many contemporaries, friends who knew Anne, journalists who covered her story, and later historians who have researched the Woodward case, believe that learning about or anticipating Capote's devastating portrayal contributed significantly to her decision to end her life. Some accounts suggest she may have seen advance copies or heard descriptions of how she would be depicted. Others speculate that the mere knowledge that such a portrayal was forthcoming, that millions would soon read Capote's version of her as deliberate murderess, proved unbearable. The precise chain of causation remains unprovable. Suicide results from complex combinations of factors, and Anne's life since 1955 had provided numerous reasons for depression and despair beyond Capote's literary betrayal. Yet the temporal proximity of her death to the publication of La Cote Basque 1965 is striking enough that most observers accept some connection seeing Capote's work as the final blow that made continued life seem impossible for a woman who had already endured 2 decades of exile, scandal, and social judgment. Anne's funeral is held at St. James's Episcopal Church on Manhattan's Upper East Side, the same social geography where she once aspired to belong and from which she was effectively expelled after Billy's death. Among those attending is Elsie Woodward, the mother-in-law who publicly defended Anne after the shooting, while privately ensuring her exile from New York society. In one of the most chilling and memorable statements associated with the entire Woodward tragedy, Elsie reportedly says of the deaths, "She shot my son, and Truman just murdered her." The comment crystallizes the complicated reality of Anne Woodward's last 20 years. Cleared by law but condemned by society, defended publicly by family while being expelled privately, and finally destroyed not by legal prosecution, but by literary portrayal. Elsie's formulation suggests a kind of equivalence between Anne's shooting of Billy, however accidental or deliberate it may have been, and Capote's characterization of Anne as a murderer, both treated as forms of killing with fatal consequences. In the years following Anne's death, both of her sons will die by suicide, completing a pattern of tragedy that makes the Woodward family a case study in how privilege and wealth cannot protect against psychological damage and dynastic destruction. The family that once represented successful banking and sporting achievement, that hosted the Duke and Duchess of Windsor and owned champion thoroughbreds, becomes instead a cautionary tale about the costs of social climbing, unhappy marriages, and the violence, both physical and literary, that can destroy lives regardless of material circumstances. Today, photographs of Anne and Billy Woodward at racetracks and social events remain in archives and historical collections. She in elegant dresses with gloves precisely adjusted, he in tuxedo or sporting tweeds, both frozen in moments that precede the tragedy that will define their legacy. One particular Life magazine spread still bears the sensational headline identifying Billy's death as the shooting of the century, its glossy pages reducing a lifetime of complicated ambition, adaptation, fear, and exclusion to a single violent moment, flattening complex human beings into characters in a lurid narrative designed to entertain rather than illuminate. The narrator observes that the gloves Anne Woodward once wore as essential accessories, tools for transformation, symbols of her successful performance of refinement, armor against the scrutiny of those who doubted her belonging, are now museum artifacts if they survive at all, their leather stiffening in climate-controlled storage, their pearl buttons intact but their original purposes obsolete. They represent a world of rigid social codes and performances that has largely disappeared, survived only in archives and histories that attempt to reconstruct how privilege once operated and what it cost those who sought to enter or maintain it. The camera lingers on a black and white press photograph from the 1950s, preserved in a magazine archive or historical collection. Anne Woodward's hand is lifted in mid-gesture, caught by the photographer's timing at a moment when she is adjusting her glove, or touching her hair, or acknowledging someone outside the frame. Her wrist is encased in fine leather, the glove's buttons visible, the fabric smooth and perfectly fitted. Light catches the material at an angle, creating a small highlight that the camera has captured and preserved. The image has not changed since it was taken decades ago. Anne's face shows the careful makeup and composed expression she cultivated through years of modeling and performance, the mask of refinement that helped her cross from Kansas to nightclubs to society ballrooms. Her clothing is immaculate, her posture controlled, every visible element of her appearance demonstrating successful mastery of the codes and signals that mark belonging to elite circles. The photograph documents a moment when the performance was working, when she looked at the part she worked so hard to play, when observers might have believed she truly belonged to the world she married into. Yet, knowing what we now know about the shooting that will occur, about the exile and alcoholism that will follow, about Truman Capote's devastating literary portrayal, and Anne's eventual suicide, the photograph becomes something other than simple documentation of glamorous social life. The gloves that seem in the moment to represent elegance and refinement become symbols of the exhausting performances required of women who cross class boundaries, of the constant self-monitoring and anxiety concealed beneath polished surfaces, of the costs exacted by a society that permits social mobility but never fully forgives the presumption of those who dare to climb. The narrator's voice falls silent, allowing the image to speak through what it shows and what it cannot show, what it preserves and what it conceals. Only our understanding of what these accessories and gestures cost their wearer has evolved. We can now see in Anne Woodward's carefully gloved hands not just the signs of successful transformation from showgirl to society wife, but also the instruments of a performance that became unsustainable, the armor that ultimately proved inadequate against the judgments and exclusions of the world she worked so desperately to enter and remain within.